Alright, we're up and rolling. What's happening, everyone? Welcome back to the third episode now, I believe we are at with this podcast series. Big week in combat sports, just to start off kind of lightly. A lot that went on in the UFC. A couple of big fights in the boxing world as well. Bellator obviously have their 199 card coming up, so there's kind of a build up for that, and obviously the big Bellator 200 that's taking place in London at the end of the month. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to get right into it. First of all, I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone enjoyed the first couple of episodes, or if this is the first episode you're listening, welcome. But we're just going to get right into it and kind of chat away and have quite a relaxed episode. I hope all of them are relaxed, but this one's going to be especially laid back. It's a Sunday I'm recording this, so obviously it's the day after the big Haye Tony Bellew fight, and so I'm in that Sunday mood of where I just want to chill out, not really do anything apart from make this podcast, which is what I'm doing. So let's get right into it. The first kind of news of the week was the Joanna Jędrzejczyk, or Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I don't know 100% how to say it. I'm just going to refer to her as what Chael Sonnen refers to her as, which is Joanna Not the Champion, because that's very funny in my opinion. So her fight with Tecia Torres has been brought forward to the Fight Night Calgary card, which is the same card as Aldo versus Jeremy Stephens. Now, I made a comment in I can't remember whether it was the first episode or the second episode, because I recorded them both quite close together and about 4 or 5 days ago. So I can't remember which episode it was I made the comment in, but I remember looking at the card. I think it was the first episode. I remember looking at the card and seeing that Aldo Stephens wasn't down to headline the card. And so when I saw that this match had been, or this fight rather, had been moved to this card, I assumed that that was in the new main event. However, upon checking the card again, it still says that there's another fight to be announced, which is quite confusing because you've now got arguably 2 fights that could main event their own fight night card that are now not down to actually main event the card that they're both on. So it doesn't make much sense to me. But I'm just having a quick look now on the UFC website, just to kind of see whether that has been updated. So, no, looking at it now, it still says that the main event is to be announced versus to be determined. I don't know who they are. They don't have very good records. That they both haven't fought before. But it's bizarre because you have Aldo Stephens, Joanna and Torres both on those cards. Don't know what's going on there. Maybe they'll update it. Maybe they just haven't got around to that yet. But I will be very surprised if one of those 2 fights doesn't main event. And I think it's probably more likely to be Aldo Stephens, just because you have the name of Jose Aldo there, who, you know, is obviously a former world champion. He was undefeated for a number of years. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. So that's what's going on there. And just a general comment on that card. Calgary are in for a treat because that fight night card is stacked. Like, I genuinely cannot remember off the top of my head anyway. I'd have to do a bit more research to kind of confirm this. But, like, I can't remember a fight night card or an FS1 card if you're in America being that stacked and that kind of having 2 huge fights that could easily be on a pay-per-view card. Probably not main event a pay-per-view card, but could easily be on the main card of a show like that. So I mean, the FS1 numbers are down on the UFC, and they have been down in general just for the whole MMA game. Like, Bellator's numbers aren't great. UFC's numbers haven't been great, especially since 205, really, since that big first card in Madison Square, or in New York, that took place in Madison Square Garden. The numbers haven't been great, so maybe this is an effort to kind of draw in the more casual viewer. Just because until Conor fights again, or one of the Diaz brothers, or GSP fights again, you're not really going to get the kind of casual, the mainstream kind of audience involved. So maybe that's what this is to do. just going to have to wait and see, and come end of July when the kind of ratings get released for that show, see if it had an effect or not, because I mean it's very, very bizarre that they've put such two huge cards, or two huge fights rather, on the same card. So we're going to have to see where that goes, but from a fan's point of view who's already invested into this sport, and the company and all the kind of fighters involved, very, very much a nice treat that I'm looking forward to. That would be a nice way to kind of kick off the summer, so to speak, if you don't class 224, sorry, I just kicked my bin, unless you don't class 224 as kicking off the summer. But either way, that's what's going on there. So other news, Derek Brunson has got his next fight booked against Antonio Carlos Jr. It's been added to UFC 227 on August 4th, which, for those of you who don't know, is the same card as TJ Dillashaw versus Cody Garbrandt 2. So I believe that's only the second fight announced for that card, so that's starting to take shape now. Derek Brunson obviously coming off of a loss to Anderson Silva, unanimous decision loss, back in February 2017, if I remember correctly. So he hasn't fought for quite a while, over a year in fact. So I mean, it'll be interesting to see how he gets on. And Antonio Carlos Jr.'s he's a good guy. He definitely knows his weight. Oh wait, sorry, no, I am mistaken. Sorry, let me just go backtrack and correct that slightly. He had 2 wins since the Anderson Silva fight, beating Daniel Kelly and Lyoto Machida, both by first round knockouts. He's coming off of a loss to Jacare. So that was his most recent fight, and that took place in January. So he's actually fought quite recently. But by the time the August card comes around, it would have been about 8 months since he's fought. So he's getting back involved. But anyway, back to my original point. He's found Carlos Jr., who's coming off of a 5-fight win streak. So, he's definitely no mug. He's just broken into the rankings of the middleweight division. I mean, I don't know as of yet how it's going to go. I'm going to have to do more research and watch a bit more tape before I come back and kind of make an educated guess, because that is what it is, essentially. That is what I'm doing. It's basically what a prediction is. Make an educated guess on who I think will walk out of that fight. I mean, if Carlos Jr. can get the win there, that's a huge win for him, because he's going to have to then overtake Derek Brunson in the rankings. And we saw a similar thing with Josh Emmett when he beat Ricardo Lamas. He jumped up from, I believe he was unranked, if not definitely 10 and above ranked. 10 to 15, that is. And he jumped up to 6th. So a win there for Carlos Jr. could definitely do him some favours and could definitely get him into that kind of top level of the middleweight division. Because if you look at the rankings from Derek Brunson and above, you have Bisping at 6, Gastelum at 5, Weidman at 4, Rockhold at 3, and we'll talk about Rockhold a bit later, and Bisping, for a matter of fact. Jacare at 2, Romero at 1, and then obviously Robert Whittaker, at the time of recording this, is the champion. They're all huge, huge stars within the kind of, if you're a fan of the sport and you're kind of really into it and you're more of a hardcore fan, should I say, it's probably a better term, you know all those guys and you know kind of the standard that they are. So for someone like Carlos Jr., who's kind of relatively, I don't want to say new to the sport, because obviously he would have been doing it since a very young age, but he is only 28 years old. 11-2 record. Sorry, word escaped me a bit there. So, he's definitely not overly experienced within the world of mixed martial arts. So for him to get a win over Derek Brunson could really do his career a world of favour. Just in a similar way we saw Colby Covington when he beat Damian Maia. Colby Covington. That's a thought for another podcast episode. But anyway, so that's kind of the news, kind of the announcements with regard to fights and that over the next 6 months or so, the summer, let's call it that. So this is now kind of not really news, it's more kind of discussion about rumours and the Diaz brothers, essentially, because quite a lot's gone on over the world of social media, more specifically Twitter, with regard to their return or their expected return. Jake Shields recently came on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani, who's obviously very well known in the journalism side of mixed martial arts, and he said he thinks Nick will be back soon. Doesn't know when, but he thinks he wants to fight and he wants to be back soon, and I have the same opinion. I think Nick will be back, and I think he'll be back soon. But obviously the biggest question at the minute is who is he going to be fighting? Because obviously he wants the title shot. He's come out and said if he wants to come back, he wants a title shot, and he wants that big money fight. But he's not going to get that title shot, not right away. He's going to have to get a couple of wins back under his belt. He hasn't fought for, quite a while. Obviously, after his whole getting banned for a lifetime, I believe it was, because of a location issue or whereabouts issue with USADA. He was kind of the first victim. Victim's not the best word, but let's use victim of that. So he hasn't actually fought since 2015, January that is, so start of 2015. So he's been out for over 3 years now, which is a long time, so he's definitely not jumping straight back into that title shot contention. So you've got to look at the options. What is there for him? Well, he wants a big money fight. Title shots off the card, that's not happening. So that rules out, probably, if you look at the rankings, that rules out the top, in that weight class anyway, welterweight, which we all presume he's not going to come back at, but middleweight, again, kind of following on from that, is probably what he's expected to come back at, because 170 is probably, I don't know this, and this isn't fact, this probably goes from my opinion, and with my experience of watching MMA over the years, that fighters who tend to leave for quite a while, or don't fight for quite a while, and come back, they have struggle making that same weight, or that they originally competed at. So I think we might see him come back at middleweight, and I think he probably would, obviously I don't know him, so I can't speak on behalf of him, but this is just my opinion. Welterweight is such a kind of stacked division as it is, similarly to lightweight, that I don't see him fancying that. You've got killers in there, like Darren Till, Kamaru Usman, who, granted his last performance wasn't the best, but he is still a beast. You've got Neil Magny, who's very accomplished and very underrated, I would say. And then going above Kamaru Usman, you've got Jorge Masvidal, who's very good. Damian Maia, Robbie Lawler, Covington, Rafael dos Anjos. And then obviously you've got Thompson and Woodley. So, to break into that top 5, 6, see how Till gets on against Wonderboy, come the UFC Liverpool card. Arguably the top 7 are going to be very difficult to break into. And to break into that and stay there, you're going to have to compete quite regularly, which I don't think Nick Diaz is willing to do. I think he is kind of going for that more less frequent big money fights. So I do feel he'll come back into the middleweight kind of weight division. So then you've got to look at the options there. Who could he potentially match up with there? Well, like we've already said, the title shot isn't on the cards. That's just the UFC won't give him that, because if he comes back, he's not reliable enough. If he was to come back and beat Whittaker, or the winner of Whittaker and Romero, he was to come back and win that and then vacate it the title because of the lack of competing. Similarly to how GSP has done, although granted to GSP, he has had an illness. So if he was to come back and win it and then walk away again, it just doesn't legitimise the middleweight division. And you've had, in recent memory, 2 old-time fighters come in. I think that would be fair to say that old-time. They kind of made their name in Strikeforce and have come back and all this. And so, anyway, yeah. So they've kind of had old-time fighters come back, win the title, and then drop it again. It just doesn't look good on behalf of the division and the UFC. So like I said, title shot out of the contention. That is not happening. So then you've got to look at it, well, is he going to be fighting someone who's lower down in the rankings? Well, he's going to have to be. He's not going to accept a fight against someone who isn't in the rankings. But we'll kind of touch on that in a minute when we discuss kind of potential fights for him, because I think there is maybe one person who he could potentially fight who isn't currently ranked. But again, we'll come on to that in a second. So I think probably the best fight for him there is probably Bisping. It's been hinted at a lot. Bisping has discussed it on Twitter, which again is something I will come on to later. And it's definitely a fun fight for everyone. I feel like they're both kind of absolute warriors inside the cage. And to see them go at it would be an extremely fun fight. Bisping said he wants to retire after this next fight, and so therefore fighting a guy like Nick Diaz is probably a very good fight to go out on, because such a big name, it will, he'll get paid quite well for that fight. It'll make good numbers, especially if it's Nick's first fight back. So that's always an option. Although Bisping did come out onto Twitter and say that he's actually too big for him now and he doesn't think he could make 185. But again, that's more kind of its own subject I'll come on to in a minute. So Bisping's kind of stated he's too big for him. That's not going to happen. So, well, what else is there for Nick? Well, there's no one above ranked number 5 other than Bisping, who's a huge name. Vito's obviously having his last fight against Machida at UFC 224. So he's out. He's presumably he's going to stick to that, and therefore he's off the cards. So the only other huge name in there, and I wouldn't even argue it's huge, well, to the hardcore fans it is, but not to the kind of mainstream market, is Lyoto Machida. Obviously he's a legend of the sport. We all know who he is, presuming we're all kind of hardcore fans. We're all in that same kind of target area. So Machida, but obviously depending on how that Belfort fight goes, that could potentially not happen. Because if Belfort starches Machida inside the first round, drops him a couple of times, and then TKOs him unconscious, isn't Nick going to want to come back and take that Machida fight? I really don't think so. As I kind of said in my UFC 224 breakdown, Machida's looking for another title run. That's why he kind of thinks this Vitor Belfort fight will kickstart, is getting him back up the rankings and into title contention. However, if he loses that, that's definitely off the cards for now, because I mean, he's already coming towards the end of his career as it is. They're both kind of legends of the sport. I mean, Machida is 39 at the minute, so to be able to come back and kind of be that young up-and-coming generation that are kind of overtaking the middleweight division now, so like your Whitakers, obviously Romero's quite a bit older, Jacare's a bit older, Luke Rockhold, Weidman, Gastelum, Brunson's obviously there, David Branch got a huge knockout on the fight night card of Kevin Lee and Edson Barboza. Brad Tavares is there as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of young talent coming through in that middleweight division. So we're going to have to see. But I feel like that Machida fight, if Machida loses, is definitely off the cards. And it's kind of a slim chance anyway. So going on to who that fighter could be who's not ranked, that Nick would fancy a fight with, is Anderson Silva. Now, obviously, there's issues surrounding Anderson Silva. He's obviously suspended for getting caught for drug, I believe it was PEDs. I don't know that off the top of my head, but he's suspended for some sort of drug-related incident. So his suspension, I checked, has around a year left. So, I mean, it depends on how long it takes Nick to kind of get sorted and want to get back in that cage and kind of get a contract agreed with the UFC. But I mean, that's probably the only fight outside of the rankings that I think Nick could take. Anderson Silva's obviously a very established name within the wider world of MMA. He's obviously very well known. I think if Nick was to come back and fight Anderson, granted that was his last fight he had before he got suspended, Nick, I think that fight could potentially entice him, but I don't feel like it's going to happen. I feel like it's probably the second best option, but I don't think it's the best option for Nick Diaz, obviously. But I feel like the fight that's probably most likely to happen is that match with GSP. Obviously, there's history there between Nick and GSP. GSP is currently not ranked in the middleweight division. He's ranked on the pound for pound, but not in the middleweight because he's suffering from an illness. Now, of course, it requires time for GSP to recover. Apologies as I just take a drink there. It takes GSP time to recover because obviously he's got to recover, get back to kind of athlete level fitness, that high standard of fitness that he always gets to. It's at middleweight, they're both kind of still coming back. They're both old timers that get big numbers. I feel middleweight is definitely an acceptable or an appropriate weight class for them both to compete at, going against each other. If I had to put money on it, I think it's going to be GSP he comes back for. I think if GSP was to come back and fight for the title again straight away, I don't feel that would make as much money as fighting Nick Diaz would. I feel what would be the best kind of business move for the UFC is to let GSP and Nick fight and kind of have that supercard kind of fight, almost kind of like the equivalent of Mayweather and Pacquiao, obviously not on a larger scale, but that kind of feel to that fight, and then let the middleweight title scene kind of move on from them, because I feel like if you just keep coming and having old timers back and coming back and winning it, granted I feel GSP is probably the number one pound for pound fighter of all time, I don't think it does anything beneficial for the rest of the fighters, and in fact, using a WWE term now, does bury, or a pro wrestling term I should say, it does in fact bury the rest of that division, which is not really what you want when you're trying to get more eyes on the sport. So I feel like that's the best option for Nick, personally anyway. But obviously, if you guys have any different opinions, please do let me know. Leave a comment on the video. If you're watching this from YouTube, send me a message on Twitter. Twitter's in the link below, in the description below. Yeah, let me know what you guys think on any of these subjects I talk about, because I'm very interested to know and see what everyone else their opinions and their stances on this. So moving on to Nate now. So obviously, the last time he fought was against Conor at 202. He's come out and said a number of times he wants that big money fight, or Conor, one and the same really. But I feel like the UFC have kind of outweighted him now, and there is talks for him to make a return back in August. He could potentially turn on that 227 card with Dillashaw and Garbrandt. That's definitely a possibility. That's the only pay-per-view for that month, and so therefore that's probably the most likely option if he was to return in August. But obviously, a month here or there either side probably isn't going to make that much of a difference in deciding whether he comes back or not. But I feel like the UFC have definitely outweighted him in this situation. He knows that the longer he was to wait for Conor, the less and less likely it was to happen, because he was losing his shine, the kind of rub that he got from McGregor from those two fights, that stardom, he was slowly losing. And unfortunately, unless there's kind of controversy around the reason that you're not fighting, like with Nick Diaz, John Jones, people like that, if you don't have that kind of controversial stance around you, you do tend to lose relevancy. And I do feel like Nate was losing some relevancy, and that kills me to say that, because Nate is one of my favourite fighters in the UFC. He has been the entire time I've watched the sport. But I feel like he's definitely losing relevancy because of his unwillingness to fight someone who isn't a huge name or isn't going to pay him big. And don't get me wrong, I feel like Nate should be getting paid big. What he's done for the sport, all of the times he's fought, I mean, he's never had a title shot, and he's been fighting 11, 12 years now. Never had a title shot. He gets good numbers, to be fair to him. When he fights on FS1 cards, they're not bad numbers. Granted, time's moved on, the sport may become less relevant, but for the time that he was fighting, his numbers were good. He played ball with Conor, and by that I mean he stepped in last on late notice against him when others wouldn't. He accepted a rematch straight away despite winning, which you don't tend to see a lot of people do. If someone like Nate had got the win over Conor, or if any other fighter had potentially got a win over Conor, the likelihood of them turning around and accepting a rematch straight away at the same stipulations, Nate went into that fight with everything to lose. Conor had nothing to lose, really. I mean, granted, he could have lost his star power a bit, but Nate had just beaten him. If Nate loses this fight, which obviously he did, he lost the rematch, Nate then, that does take away from his first victory. And it did, that is exactly what happened. And so he's done a lot for the UFC over the years, Nate. Granted, he's not always been the best to work with from reports we've heard, but I feel like he definitely deserves that big money fight. But Conor he's not getting Conor, unfortunately. That is just not the place. I feel like that kind of fire's died down quite considerably since then. The UFC have missed that. Maybe if there was to be some more controversy or some more kind of beef between the two, whether that's over social media, in a confrontation in person, if they were to be at the same media event or something along those lines, that could potentially re-spark it. But I feel like for the time being, that fight definitely needs to be put in the UFC's back pocket and come back to that at a later date. So then what are the options for him? Well, if you look at the lightweight rankings, which we often do, I tend to go to the rankings because it's a good way to kind of get an idea of who's currently in a good position. And even though the UFC don't totally always go off the rankings, it's a good base to kind of see, well, who's available, who's about, who's booked, who isn't. So Conor, that's not happening. He's not walking straight back in against Khabib. That just won't happen. That division has got too many contenders for Nate to walk back in off of over a 2-year would it be a 2-year absence? Almost a 2-year absence. No, it might be closing down on that 2-year absence now. I believe the fight was in August, if I'm correct. Yeah, the fight was in August, so almost a 2-year layoff. He's not walking back in against Khabib. That's just unfair to everyone else in that division. I feel like the UFC would get a lot of stick for that. Obviously, Conor, like you just mentioned, isn't on the cards. Tony's currently injured. I feel if Tony, when he comes back, will either fight Conor or Khabib. Most likely the winner of Conor and Khabib. But one of those two. Then you've got those that are level-headed going into the lightweight title, and that is Eddie Alvarez, Dustin Poirier, and Kevin Lee. So they're obviously ranked 3, 4, and 5 now. Does Nate walk back in against one of them? If you do the maths, it adds it up. It means you've then got 2 and 2, almost have like a mini tournament. You have Eddie Alvarez and Poirier, and Kevin Lee and Diaz. That kind of sorts that issue out, and then you have maybe one of those two who get through those first 2 fights, fight each other, or depending on the situation at the top, fight the champion. So that always is an option. Does it happen though? I feel it probably does. There's not much else there in that division. I mean, you could have him fight Barboza. That would be a very interesting fight. I'd very much like to see that. It'd be nice for Barboza to fight a striker, or someone who likes to brawl and stand on his feet rather than fighting another wrestler. Because, I mean, the past 2 fights Barboza's had, I felt incredibly bad for him because he's not had the best stylistic matchup. That would be a very fun fight. I'd very much like to see that. You've also got Gaethje, which I think would be an absolute potential fight of the year candidate, I feel. Do you give that to him though? I've put it on an FS1 card. It would make great numbers, for sure. But I feel like because of the absence of both the Diaz brothers, neither of them will fight on an FS1 card. I think if they're going to return, or when they return, it will for sure be on a pay-per-view. Just because their numbers have always been so good, everyone's dying to see them back. They won't give that away for free, I feel. Although with the new TV deal coming up, you never know, but that's just my opinion on that. So who do I think Nate's going to get? I do feel it's probably someone between... I don't feel he's going to get Eddie Alvarez. I feel like having a number 3 fight, a number 8, when that division is so dense with competition, isn't logistically, like, it just doesn't make sense. Poirier, potentially. If Poirier doesn't fight Eddie Alvarez, that's definitely an option. I feel like he's probably most likely going to get Kevin Lee or one of Barboza or Gaethje. I would, personally for me, I would quite like to see him fight Gaethje. I feel like Gaethje, as he's currently come out and said, only has a number of fights left. I would like to see him fight Nate and probably get, a bit of star power from that fight, especially if he wins. So that's what I would personally like to see. However, I do think Nate is probably most likely to get Kevin Lee in that situation. But that's the way it is. It'd be interesting. I'd like to see any of those fights. So moving on now, I recently touched upon earlier, was Bisping announcing on Twitter that he can't make 185. Well, obviously there's been a lot of talk recently about Bisping's retirement fight. So if he can't make 185, where does that leave him? Well, obviously he's got to move up to light heavyweight. He stated on Twitter that he currently is walking around at 225 pounds and he doesn't think he'd make 185 again. So the 2 options for him are either he competes at the higher weight, which would be light heavyweight, or to not compete. Well, we know he's most likely going to compete. He's come out and said he's not sure whether he will, but we all know Bisping, we all know the fighter in him and the kind of fire that he has. I think he's probably likely to have one more big fight before he calls it a day, kind of pass on the torch, so to speak. So then you've got to look at his options there. So he's fighting at a higher weight class. Well, is he going to fight in the light heavyweight division, or does he do kind of a super fight at a catchweight? If you look at the catchweight, is there anyone from middleweight who's willing to step up and kind of go up maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 pounds to fight him? I feel like a lot of them are very much settled in that division, although there's one name in there who I feel probably stands out further than the rest, but that's someone we'll kind of talk about momentarily in the moment. So I feel like he's probably most likely to stand when he enters the cage at 205. I feel like he's probably going to have to go back to his original division that he started at light heavyweight. So what's for him at light heavyweight then? Well, it's no secret that division is pretty stale at the minute. There's not really much movement. There's nothing really exciting happening. Hence why DC's had to go and fight Stipe now. So you've got to look at him. Well, is there anyone around that weight limit, not strictly in that weight limit, but around that weight limit, that would be an interesting fight for Bisping? That would make sense for Bisping. And that would, kind of not necessarily, I don't really know how to word this, but not necessarily make it so that this Bisping fight is kind of like a deadpan fight. And by that I mean, if Bisping comes back and is fighting an up-and-comer and starches him, that doesn't really do any favours for anyone. I feel like the UFC, if they're going to book this fight, is going to have to kind of get something beneficial out of it, whether it's financially for them, which would mean Bisping would have to have a super fight, or whether it's by getting another fighter over with the crowd. Again, another pro wrestling term there. I do apologise if any of you absolutely loathe pro wrestling, but it's a good way of getting knowledge across, I suppose. So, what's for him in light heavyweight? Well, he's not going to step into the title picture. He actually said on Twitter that DC has bigger fish to fry, which he does. If he wins and does beat Stipe Miocic, I can imagine DC probably, because of the giant gap in the weight limit between weight classes, I don't see him defending both belts. That would be extremely difficult to do because obviously 205 limit to then make to 140. Huge gap, I don't see it. I feel DC, if he wins a light heavyweight, is giving up that belt. Which then, I kind of hope he doesn't do that, because that does really leave the light heavyweight division dead in the water, essentially. There's nothing going on in that division right now. So obviously, go back to my original point. Bisping isn't going into the title shot. He isn't going into the title picture, which again kind of rules out that top 3 to 5. He's not getting Gustafsson, because if he beats Gustafsson, that does no favours for anyone. Gustafsson's just signed a new contract with the UFC, so I don't see why they'd give him that fight. Ozdemir, again, kind of coming back off that DC loss. I believe that was his last fight, was against DC. I may be wrong there. Let me just check double quickly. Yeah, his last fight was him losing to DC's rebooked to fight Shogun the 22nd of July. So he's got that to kind of come up. We'll see how that goes on. And so, you've got Glover there, and Ilir Latifi, and then Jan Blachowicz. I don't see him fighting up against any of those because A, none of them are really big enough names for him. They're not going to be a big enough draw. And B, it doesn't do any favours for the title picture. It just eliminates another potential contender for that division if Bisping's able to come up a weight class and then beat them. Which we can't rule out Bisping ever, because he's such a warrior and such an animal inside that cage that you can never ever rule him out really in any fight. Unless it's at 185 now. But so yeah, that rules out probably the top 5, I'd say. So like I've touched on previously, he'll either be fighting an up-and-comer or someone who's been away for a while, i.e. Nick Diaz, hence why there was so much kind of speculation around that. The other option is he fights someone who he's had a bit of history with, someone there's a bit of backstory, like we see in WWE a lot. These bigger fights do tend to get built up through their backstory. So who's around that light heavyweight barrier weight class? That was a weird word to use, barrier. Around that light heavyweight weight class who could potentially fight Bisping, has history with Bisping, has talked about being at 205. Well, that leaves Luke Rockhold. He's mentioned about fighting 205 before because he wanted to come up. He had that social media beef with Gustafsson. He talks about coming up to 205. He's mentioned before how he really struggles with the 185 weight cut, which is not surprising. He's a huge guy. He's 163. He's 6'3". And I mean, when he gets to 185, he is shredded. So it is a very tough weight cut for him. So he's mentioned about going up to 205 before. So could he fight Bisping in his retirement fight at 205? Well, do the audience want to see it? I can vouch for myself and say, not really at this current moment in time. We've seen them fight twice before. They're at one apiece. Now, obviously, history kind of dictates that you go to that third fight. But you tend to see in that third fight something is on the line. Like we saw with Dominic Cruz and Uriah Faber. And I'm sure like we'll see in the future. Nothing kind of comes to my head at the minute. JDS and Cain Velasquez back in the day. There is always kind of something on the line that isn't really here. Neither of them will be holding the light heavyweight title anytime soon anyway. Unless DC loses it beats Stipe, and vacates this title, I don't feel like having two middleweights who are moving up a weight to fight for the title makes sense. So I feel like until something kind of sparks that rivalry, or if something is to spark that rivalry again, I feel like that is probably not likely to happen. Although on paper it does make sense, but the audience reception just won't be there for it. There's no interest. But I'm sure if you gave both of them the option to go at it one more time, I'm sure they would, because their hatred for each other, from what I know, unless it's all at work, is real and genuinely quite heated. So that's always good fun. So you've got to look at it. Well, I've kind of mentioned the criteria of what the options are for him. So someone who could potentially return and hasn't fought in a while. I touched on Nick Diaz. That sounded very wrong. I mentioned Nick Diaz. I discussed a potential option of him. I feel like 205 is too big a weight class for Nick Diaz. So you've got to look at who in the 205 weight class is potentially returning. Well, I had to scroll through who's under contract with the UFC at that weight class who is a big enough name to entice Bisping, isn't going to be jumping straight back into the title scene when he comes back. I think the best candidate, and one who has not been mentioned anywhere I've seen online, is John Jones. Now, a lot of people are going to be a bit confused by that, because John Jones not coming back into the title scene straight away. He fought OSP before he fought DC when he came back. Now, granted, that was for the interim belt. The UFC are getting a lot of negative kind of backlash from the amount of interim titles they're giving out. I feel like if they're to do it again for Jones, it just wouldn't make sense. If DC's to beat Stipe, as I've kind of mentioned previously, and he vacates that light heavyweight title, then that opens the door for John Jones to come back and fight for the belt. If DC beats Stipe, I don't think he will personally. I think Stipe's got that, which means DC keeps hold of the light heavyweight title. I then think if he loses to Stipe, he comes back down to light heavyweight. So are we going to jump straight back into that DC Jones 3 fight? DC's the champion. Obviously, history dictates that if one fighter fights another fighter twice and one fighter wins both times, you don't have that third fight. But this title, obviously, Jones is going to want it. He's obviously 2-0 to DC, although one did get overturned. But if he kind of is guilty for what we believe he is, which is a trace supplement that he didn't intend to take and would have had very limited effects on his performance, then you could argue it could be 2-0 potentially. I feel like John Jones coming back and fighting Bisping, not only is that a huge send-off fight for Bisping, it reintroduces Jones into the weight division, gives him that warm-up fight that he needs. Bisping would obviously want to take that fight. It's a huge payday for him. And it ties over that light heavyweight division until DC comes back after fighting Stipe. So at the minute, there's nothing really going on. Obviously, you've got Gustafsson there, who's really the only contender to DC out of anyone in that division, in my opinion. So Jones and Bisping at light heavyweight, it brings attention to that division, and it could definitely spark some interest if we were to kind of build a story from that Jones is on this redemption arc, that he was kind of accused of something he was not guilty of. I feel like this could definitely be a way to rejuvenate the light heavyweight division. Have him fight Bisping. He gets back. It's a big fight. Everyone will tune in for that purely to see Bisping say goodbye and for Jones's return. It will kind of bring eyes back to that division. Have Jones then at the end of that fight kind of maybe fight DC. I would like to see him fight Gustafsson again, and the winner of that goes on to fight DC. And it builds more of kind of an arc of Jones is having to overcome adversity, because before, obviously he's already had to overcome adversity with what he's dealt with during kind of his adult life. I don't know about his childhood, but from what I know about his adult life, he's obviously had to overcome a lot. Have him have to fight Gustafsson, who people believe was his hardest fight while he was champion. Have him overcome that if he's able to overcome that, and then fight the champion. It gives him kind of hurdles to jump through and kind of earn back the audience's trust and support. And so it does that, I feel, is the best option in not only giving Bisping his retirement fight, reintroducing Jones, but also getting interest back in that division, which it desperately needs. Because at one time in UFC history, the light heavyweight division was one of the most entertaining divisions in the company. You had Chuck Liddell in there, Tito Ortiz, Shogun Rua when he was back at his kind of heyday. You know, like, there was a lot of talent in that, and it's kind of dwindled down. So that's what I feel like they should go with, is have Bisping fight Jones. But that's my take. Obviously, you all may have different opinions, but that's why I think the UFC should do from a business and from a kind of sport entertainment standpoint. So moving on now, we've got even more Twitter beef between Dillon Danis. Obviously got his win at UFC Bellator 198 on the weekend, or last weekend, and he had beef with Bisping. So it's been a very Bisping heavy episode, this one. But he had beef with Bisping, and Bisping has obviously made a comment on Dillon Danis' choice of clothing at Bellator 198, which a lot of people made comments on, obviously being very similar to that of Conor McGregor's clothing, and the way he kind of held himself and presented himself was very similar to that. What I believe to have happened is Bisping made a comment on his Believe You Me podcast about Dillon Danis and his kind of whole copying, so to speak, of McGregor. So Danis responded on Twitter by saying he wasn't one to comment about fashion, and kind of an old picture of Bisping from, I believe, the Ultimate Fighter days that he put up. And Bisping kind of fired back and said, well, that was sponsorship, you should probably try and get some. And all this kind of not lighthearted, but kind of taking jabs at each other. And then RDA came in out of nowhere and kind of said, good one, just that. So that was kind of, we're not sure whether that was sarcasm or not. We don't think it was, just because of the language barrier kind of wouldn't account for that. But it could very well have been, but I don't believe it was. And then Dillon started with RDA, who just told him not to speak out of line and that he pulls out of every fight. RDA came back and said he was winning world titles when Dillon was just a kid. And then Dillon said that RDA would pull out of a fight when he stepped on Lego, if he was to step on a Lego brick, which is quite funny. I would certainly pull out of a fight if I stepped on a Lego brick, because that shit hurts. Sorry for the language, but it does. So that was just a bit of an interesting kind of occurrence that happened in the space of about an hour on Twitter. Obviously, it will never come to fruition because they're all at different weight classes, which makes no sense. But it's just an interesting little thing that happened and probably worth taking note on, but I'm not going to spend any more time on that than I need to. So moving on now, we've got Holloway. He came out on UFC Tonight earlier in the week and said how he would like to fight Khabib after getting past Ortega on July 7th. Obviously, we had the fight that was arranged between them on short notice. When Tony Ferguson pulled out, that was going to be 155. Although obviously Holloway struggled to make weight and actually got withdrawn by the doctors because of that. I mean, I'd love to see the fight. Max Holloway is probably my favourite fighter in the UFC right now. He comes across as a very good guy, very cool guy, very laid back, very respectful, while still kind of, being able to talk. But I hope he's not looking past Ortega, man. Ortega is a bad man in terms of fighting. He's just as tough as they come. He takes your punches and walks forward, and not many people do that. I don't know how that fight's going to go. Again, like I said, with most of these occasions, when it comes to me doing an episode on that fight card, I'm going to have to break it down. I'm going to have to look at it at a number of levels and come to a calculated guess on what I think could happen. But I really hope Holloway isn't looking past Ortega and is very much focused on that. And he did make a comment saying he's interested to, but he's got to deal with Ortega first. But it's never a good sign when you see people kind of looking at what's beyond a fight before they've even had the fight that's right in front of them. I don't even know how to root for that because I like both fighters a lot. I'm just gonna have to stay impartial to that one. I'll make a prediction, but I'm staying impartial. I'm not supporting either guy on that one. But I feel like that fight with Holloway and Khabib, if Khabib's able to hold onto the belt and Holloway's able to get past Ortega, even if he's not able to get past Ortega, if he does lose to Ortega, it still opens the door for him to be able to move up a weight. But that is a super fight, and as we've seen recently, Dana White does like making those super fights, and so it's definitely on the cards. It definitely has the audience there. I'd like to see it. I feel like Holloway and Khabib have that wider pool on the audience, not quite to the degree of McGregor, but they definitely have that wider pool. I feel like the matchup, stylistically, that's a tough one for Max to get through. I mean, the issue I see with Max is because his style of fighting very much depends upon him punching in volume and striking in volume. He doesn't tend to deliver one huge knockout punch like Ngannou or someone like that, or Conor. He's very much a grind and wear you down on the feet, whereas Khabib's obviously a grind and wear you down on the ground. I feel like the only way Khabib is ever going to get beat is if someone's able to stuff his takedowns, which Holloway hasn't shown massive ability in being able to do that. Conor has done more so, I would say. I feel that Khabib is only going to get stopped by someone who has the punching power to be able to knock him out in one punch. I don't feel Tony is able to do that, because Tony is more of a scrapper and he'll drag you into those later rounds and make it, a dog-eat-dog fight. I don't think Holloway has that. Holloway is a very similar striker to Tony in terms of dragging you into those later rounds, and he's going to outgrind you and he's going to hang in there and he's going to grit down on his mouthpiece, walk forward, draw the line in the sand and exchange. Whereas Conor is very much wanting to stop you in that fight, and I feel like, to be honest, Conor probably has the best chance of beating Khabib out of those three we just mentioned. So I would have to probably take Khabib on it. I'm gonna do a more thorough breakdown if we ever get to that fight. I hope we do, but if we ever get there, I'll do a thorough breakdown. But it's just a nice little note to know that Max in the back of his mind still has the 155-pound division there, and he is still, just because that fight with Khabib fell through doesn't mean he's not thinking about it. And then moving on, finally, the last little bit of UFC news. The UFC Liverpool promo got dropped, which is awesome. I currently finish university the Thursday before that fight card, which I believe is the 24th. So I'll be home, hopefully, for that fight card when it happens on the Saturday. So I'll be watching it, for sure. Darren Till's on there, which is always an entertaining fight, as well as Stephen Thompson. Made me hyped. For fight nights, I don't tend to get very excited. I tend to kind of enjoy them but not look forward to them, and that makes any sense. I do with the occasional ones, just because big fights like the Aldo Stevens, I look forward to that. I looked forward to Lee and Barboza. I don't tend to look forward to the lesser, I don't know what the word is to describe it, but kind of the fights that don't have exciting fights on there. So for example, we've got Mayer and Usman coming up on a fight night card on the 20th of May. For me, that doesn't really do anything. I'll watch it for the purposes of getting the podcast out and for the purposes of being an MMA and UFC fan. But I won't be excited for it if I miss it. It's not going to be one of those fight nights where I have to watch it live. I'll watch it the next day if need be. Whereas Till Thompson, I'll be watching that live. Aldo Stevens, I'll be watching that live. There's a number of fight cards that I'm very excited for, but unfortunately, that Mayer, Usman, and a couple of ones over the summer, I'm not hugely sold on yet. But we'll see. You never know. The card could get kind of thickened out as we get closer to the date. But yeah, that promo for UFC Liverpool made me hyped. Really looking forward to it now. More so than I was before. And UFC, they're getting their promo game down. There's definitely been improvements, and it's definitely a good marketing tool on their part. I hope the card does good numbers. I feel like Teal's a big draw, especially in the UK. Thompson's a huge name. It's the first fight card in Liverpool. It ticks all the boxes in terms of, for an FS1 card, picking up good ratings. I think it will probably be one of the better rating fight nights of the summer, maybe of the year potentially, depending on what they book for the remainder of that final kind of third of the year. I'm excited. I hope it goes well. I hope it lives up to the hype. Really do. I really do. So we're going to move on and talk about Bellator 199 now. That's happening a week today. I'm recording this on the Sunday. I might release this today. I might not. I might hold it and do it tomorrow, depending on what time I get wrapped up and packed down. But that's happening next weekend. And it's obviously the next fixture in the heavyweight Grand Prix that they're doing. It's Ryan Bader versus King Mo, which is a very intriguing matchup. Both have come from, for those of you who don't follow Bellator and just follow UFC, they've both come up from light heavyweight to fight in this heavyweight Grand Prix. So it's interesting in that respect. But Bader's the current champion at light heavyweight, with King Mo being the number one contender. But the title isn't on the line here. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Ryan won't have the pressure of having his title on the line. Mo won't have to worry about the title being on the line either. You know, he knows if he loses this, he's still got light heavyweight in his back pocket that he can drop to. But what happens after with the division? Because if Bader wins, well, that stalls the whole lightweight division, because obviously he can't defend his belt until after the Grand Prix is over. Does he vacate? I think I like to think he probably won't. I think he'll keep hold of the belt. But obviously he can't defend. And so King Mo then, well, what does he do? He's just lost to the champion. Normally you'd see in that situation, a number one contender losing to a champion, their ranking would decrease. They'd go down a bit. But it's not at 205. So does that mean King Mo's rankings will be affected? Will they completely ignore the matchup with regard to the light heavyweight division as a whole? What happens for King Mo afterwards if he then has to fight number 2, number 3 ranked contender and loses? Does that then mean he's completely out of the title picture without actually getting a shot at the title at 205? Who knows? If Bader loses and King Mo progresses, well, the light heavyweight division can continue because Bader wouldn't have lost the belt. However, after this Grand Prix, does that mean King Mo he has to be guaranteed a shot at the light heavyweight title once this is all over? Because he's just beaten the champion at a higher weight class. So it's very interesting to see what's going to go down. I don't really know. I think Bader will probably win this. I feel he's just a superior fighter in general. His wrestling's phenomenal. I just think Bader will progress, and at least that will then allow the light heavyweight division time to kind of define a number one contender. Because if King Mo loses here, people could argue that he shouldn't be number one contender, and it just gives him time to fight again, find it, and just kind of allow the light heavyweight division to kind of organise itself and prepare itself for when Bader does eventually return, and who will be ready to step up and fight him. But the winner of this bracket will go on to face Matt Mitrione in their next kind of fixture. I gotta say, Matt Mitrione for me is probably the favourite at this point. I feel he'll probably go on and win it. As much as I'd love to see Chael Sonnen go on and win, I do feel probably Matt Mitrione is the favourite of the whole tournament. I believe he was at the start. I believe him and Roy Nelson were probably the two favourites going in at the start. Looking at the kind of the brackets of that first round, yeah, I'd probably say they were the two favourites going into it. But I feel like, well, it wasn't seeded. Chael came out and said that the whole kind of heavyweight Grand Prix he doesn't believe was seeded. They don't know for sure, but they don't believe it was because he still feels that the two best and that kind of the two favourites of the whole Grand Prix drew each other first, which obviously means it wouldn't be seeded. But I don't know, it's bizarre. But anyway, yeah, that's what's going on there. Hopefully, I would like to see Bader come through that. I think he will. And it'll be interesting to see what goes on with the light heavyweight division from there onwards. I'm not going to break it down as much as I do with the UFC cards. But, you know, I will report on the result and kind of the wins and who got what down the card and all that kind of thing. And I believe Paul Daly, who also used to be in the UFC, he's famous for punching Josh Koscheck. Yeah, there you go. Famous for punching Josh Koscheck after the bell went in his fight when Josh beat him by unanimous decision. So if you've seen that clip on YouTube, that's who that guy is. But he's actually doing all right now in Bellator. I quite like him. I think he's quite a nice guy. There was just kind of he saw the red mist kind of descended upon him in that moment, and he's not allowed to fight in the UFC again, according to Dana White, but is what it is. He's over in Bellator now, doing alright for himself. So we're going to talk about the boxing now. Obviously we had two huge fights. This is, as I've said, Sunday I'm recording this, so they were last night. We had David Haye versus Tony Bellew, which was probably the biggest fight in England so far this year. No, because Joshua fought. Probably the second biggest fight in the UK this year, if you don't include George Groves fighting. If you don't include quite a few people fighting, I don't really know why I said that. It's probably not true. No, it probably is, because they fought the O2, which is a big venue. No, I'd say it's probably the second biggest fight in the UK this year. Definitely not including the US, but definitely in the UK. So you had Haye versus Bellew. Now, I picked Haye on points before. In my predictions, I couldn't be more wrong. Bellew looked phenomenal. Let's just start off there. Give credit where it's due to Tony Bellew. He looked incredible. He dropped Haye twice in that third round, and again in the fifth before stopping him in the fifth. He just looked great. He genuinely just looked probably the best he's looked in his career. He boxed from a technical standpoint, his boxing was incredible. The best we've seen of him. Definitely not the performance I was expecting, but it definitely is the kind of performance that will open more doors for him now, especially at heavyweight. Yeah, he definitely looked good. You can't deny that. You can't take that away from him. Even if you don't like the guy, he definitely put in a shift. So for those of you who didn't watch it, started off the first round was kind of tentative. Neither fighter kind of went for it until the last minute of that. In the second, again, it was very much the same. It was very level pegging field, maybe tip it slightly to Tony, but nothing huge of note. And then the third was when Tony kind of stepped up the pace. He dropped Haye twice with a beautiful left hook, and then I believe it was a right hand, if my memory serves me correct. It was very late, I was very tired. I believe it was a left hook and a right hand. Might have been a right hand and left hook. It was a left and a right. Apologies for that. So yeah, he dropped him twice in that round, and Haye kind of staggered back to his corner. The fourth round, Tony just piled on the pressure, continued, kept up the pace. Wasn't able to knock him down though, and then in the fifth he dropped Haye again. He returned to his feet. Tony stepped forward and started unloading on him, and Foster, the referee, stepped in and just had enough. You can't argue with it. It's a fair stoppage. David Haye looked out. He looked like he was having trouble with his right ankle, which obviously he had his surgery on his Achilles after the last fight, which was on his right lower leg, right foot, right ankle area. So there was kind of question about whether that was flaring up again, but he didn't get the opportunity to drag it into the later rounds, and so Bellew won fair and square. It was a great performance by Bellew. Very interesting to see where he'll go from here. He name-dropped Tyson Fury, which I thought was interesting, especially considering Tyson's so involved with Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. I feel that's probably a bit above him for now. I'm not saying he's not capable. He's probably a bit too small for Tyson Fury, though, I'd like to think. Just purely from a height size, I don't think he could probably cope with Tyson. But, you know, he's name-dropped him, and he's put his name... The thing is, I'm now talking about him. His name's now in the hat. So he's done. He's set out what he wanted to achieve. Because we're having this conversation about him potentially fighting Tyson Fury. Whether it will happen, I don't think it will happen. I feel like Tyson is gunning for AJ or Deontay Wilder, but his name's in the hat now, and you can't knock him for that. He's done what he wanted. He also talked about Andre Ward. Again, Andre Ward's obviously retired. I don't feel Bellew's the name to bring him out of retirement. Andre Ward's never really hinted that he wants to come out of retirement. I feel like with every fighter, they have their price, as we've seen with Mayweather. He's come out of retirement twice. I believe it's twice. Yeah, it's twice. Once to fight McGregor, once to fight... I can't remember. No, it wasn't Pacquiao. But he's come out of retirement twice. I don't feel Bellew's got the name to bring out Andre Ward, unfortunately. I'd like to see the fight. I feel it'd be a very interesting fight. I do think Ward would just take it. Ward's one of the best fighters of the past decade, in my opinion. But I don't think Bellew's got the stature to be able to kind of take him on and, kind of financially want to bring him out. With regard to Haye, what's next for him? I don't like to say this because I don't feel like I have the right to say this. I don't think, that it's fair for me to make this comment, but I'm going to make it because it's my opinion, and I wouldn't do you guys the disservice of not giving you my honest opinion. But I feel Haye should probably call it a day now. He's lost back-to-back against Bellew. He's struggling. His body's... It almost looked like his body kind of gave up on him in there. Obviously, he's had huge surgeries over the past couple of years. On his bicep, his shoulder, his Achilles as well after the last fight. I do think it's time for him, unfortunately, for him to walk away. There's been a lot of that speculation around. It just makes sense. There's no point in him trying to push on because, his body's unfortunately given up on him. He's had a good run, made a name for himself. I'm presuming he made quite a bit of money. But, he should really hang up the gloves now because there's not much on the cards for him now. He's not going to be as big a draw. He's not going to be able to fight, pull in those kind of big names that he wants to fight anymore now. His whole idea was that he was going to kind of come back and wanted another title run. That's so far out the window now, it's just irredeemable, really. Unfortunately for Haye, I don't like to say it because I quite like him as a boxer. I just feel like that's time now for him anyway, but we'll see what happens. Again, like I said, this is Sunday early afternoon, so not much has come out as of yet, but he could turn around and say he wants to fight again, which I think would be crazy, but you never know with David Haye. Is a bit like that. So obviously Gennady Golovkin fought last night, which was supposed to be the rescheduled fight with Canelo Alvarez. Alvarez got done for, I can't remember the name of the drug, but it was something he blamed on tacos in Mexico, which is just not true, like I touched upon in a previous episode. But that's just not, it just annoys me because it's just clear lies. But hey ho, it's nothing to do with me really, but that's my opinion. So anyway, he stopped the American I believe his name is Maturiason, in the second round quite convincingly. It was obviously his record equaling 20th title defense in the middleweight division. Obviously being a different weight than it is in the UFC, for those of you who don't know, the kind of weight classes don't directly correspond. So for example, 185 in the UFC isn't middleweight in boxing, if that makes any sense. So he equaled the title defense record, which is cool to see. I think he'll probably smash it. Comfortable victory, never really looked in trouble. Very typical day at the office for Golovkin, really. You can't blame Martirison because he came in a late notice. He moved up a weight class. He normally fights at light middleweight. So, you can't really blame the guy. Fair play to him for taking it on, but, it would have been unbelievable had the American won. I don't think it was going to. I feel like now they're going to try and remake the Canelo fight because its suspension ends in August. But I really doubt that fight happens. I feel like there's just going to be too many barriers to overcome. There's going to be the whole drug testing thing now that they're going to want to kind of enforce upon Canelo. Rightly so, because I'm incredibly against PEDs and performance and like kind of steroids to enhance performance and all this kind of thing. So I don't feel that fight happens. at all. Maybe if it does happen, it's a similar scenario to Mayweather-Pacquiao where it's down the line and they're both towards the end of their careers, but I don't feel like that's happening right now. But it would be awesome to see Triple G break the title defense record by beating Canelo. But like I said, don't think the fight happens. And the final bit of news for today's episode is Rio Ferdinand. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, footballer for Manchester United and a number of other clubs in the English Premier League. He started training boxing, I believe it was September, maybe slightly earlier, maybe in August. He started training last year. And he kind of set out a goal that he wanted to win a belt, whether it was kind of a British heavyweight title or I don't think he would have ever got to the world stage, but he wanted to win a title. That was his goal. He has unfortunately been denied his boxing license by the British Board of Boxing the British Boxing Board of Control. So unfortunately, we're not going to be seeing him fighting professionally. I mean, it's not surprising again, is it really? He's 39 years old now. He's definitely kind of past any kind of physical prime that he would have had. He's only been boxing less than a year. I mean, his trainer said, and Rio said, that it's a shame because they wouldn't even go down to the gym where he trains to kind of watch him and make a more informative decision. But I mean, he was fighting a losing battle because they're never going to give someone a boxing license when they've been fighting less than a year. And you tend to find that like professional boxers at this level have been fighting since early teens, even younger at times. So it wasn't surprising in the slightest. But it's a shame because obviously there's been a fair amount of publicity surrounding him. And to never see him perform is obviously kind of disappointing. It's like the kind of whole thing in storytelling with regards to films. If you show the gun in the first act, you've got to use it in the third. And that just hasn't happened here. We've kind of been shown that he's been training. We're not going to see the payoff of him getting to fight. So he says he's hanging up his gloves now. And that is kind of the end of the boxing journey for him. Again, respect to anyone. I used to box when I was younger. Respect to anyone who gives it a go. It's not as easy as it looks. You need to be a lot more kind of well-rounded as an athlete to be able to box. You need a high fitness. You need good agility. You need to obviously be able to box. You need good movement. There's a number of aspects to boxing, and it takes a lot more than meets the eye, so to speak. But yeah, that's it for this episode. It's been a bit longer today, so I hope it's been fun for those of you who have still stuck around. As always, if you've got any kind of feedback, please let me know, whether it's leaving a comment, messaging me on YouTube, sending me an inbox on Twitter. My Twitter and Instagram are both in the description below. Yeah, I've hoped you've enjoyed it. I've hoped it's been informative. Please subscribe if you're watching through YouTube. If you're not watching through YouTube, go to YouTube and subscribe, because that's where I'll be uploading pretty much all the episodes. So yeah, that's it for everyone. See you guys next time. Probably my next episode will probably be coming out probably at the end of this week by the time you're listening to this. So kind of Thursday, Friday time. And it probably won't be as long an episode because I don't know how much news is going to come out over the next couple of days. But there might be some. We never know. That's the exciting world of mixed martial arts and boxing. So anyway, catch you guys next time.